You think you'd notice at first, the way the air feels heavier, the world quieter, the shadows stretching longer than they should. But you don't. You don't notice the unnatural things until they've already wrapped themselves around you. By then, it's too late. It started with the alert. I was sitting on my couch, eating a dinner I barely remembered making, when the tone blared through my phone. That long, droning sound that grabs you by the throat. My hand shook as I reached for it, the screen casting an eerie glow in the dim room. Attention. Effective immediately. Stay indoors. Do not go outside after sunset. Avoid moonlight. This is not a test. I laughed. I mean, what else are you supposed to do when the government tells you to hide from the moon? My neighbors didn't seem worried either. Outside, I could hear kids laughing, a basketball thudding on pavement, and the faint hum of a lawnmower down the street. Life goes on, right? Then I noticed the moon. It was bright, too bright, a crimson sphere hanging low in the sky, its light bathing the street in a sickly red glow. It wasn't just unnatural. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the same sky as the stars. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. Something about it kept pulling me in, whispering to that deep, primal part of my brain that knows when to be afraid. The first scream snapped me out of it. It came from somewhere down the block, a high, jagged wail that cut through the night like broken glass. I froze, straining to hear more. The sound of shattering wood followed, then muffled yelling. I moved to the window, pulling the blinds back just a crack. The street was still, the red glow casting long, unnatural shadows over the houses. A dark figure stumbled into view, running from something I couldn't see. They tripped, landing hard on the asphalt, their body twitching like a broken marionette. That's when I saw it. It stepped into the light, and for a moment, my mind refused to process what I was looking at. Its body was impossibly large, hunched and covered in matted fur slick with something dark. Its head, God, its head was wrong. Half wolf, half something much worse. Its elongated jaws lined with jagged teeth that glistened as it snarled. The person on the ground tried to crawl away, sobbing, their voice hoarse and desperate. The creature watched them for a moment, tilting its head as if deciding what to do. Then it lunged. I'll never forget the sound, the wet crunch as its claws sank into their back, ripping through skin and bone. The way their screams turned into a gurgling rasp as blood poured from their mouth. The creature's jaws closed around their throat, shaking them like a rag doll until the screaming stopped. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grab the lock on the front door. I flipped it, then ran to the kitchen to bolt the back door too. Outside, the howls started. Not just one, but many. Long, mournful cries that sent a chill down my spine. They echoed through the neighborhood, each one louder and closer than the last. A sharp knock at the front door made me jump. It wasn't the loud, forceful kind. This was soft, deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. "Please," a voice whispered. "Let me in." I didn't move. The knock came again, harder this time. "I know you're in there. Open the door." The desperation in their voice froze me in place. I wanted to help, but the memory of that thing tearing through flesh and bone was fresh in my mind. What if I opened the door and let it in? "Please," they screamed, pounding now. "It's coming. It's..." Their words dissolved into a blood-curdling scream. The sound of claws on concrete followed, then the wet, unmistakable sound of something tearing. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed without even thinking. My breath came in shallow gasps as the growling outside grew louder. Then I heard it, sniffing, just on the other side of the door. It was close enough that I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, testing the strength of the barrier. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, vibrating in my chest. I closed my eyes, my grip tightening on the knife. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. When I finally opened my eyes, I thought I was safe. I was wrong. The silence was the worst part. It clung to the walls, to my skin, to every breath I tried to take. My house, which had always felt too small, now stretched endlessly around me. Every shadow, another potential threat. I stayed pressed against the wall near the front door, my fingers aching from how tightly I clutched the knife. I strained to hear something, anything, but the scratching was gone. The growling was gone. That didn't mean it wasn't still out there. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Time blurred into something meaningless. My heart had finally slowed to something resembling normal when a sound shattered the fragile calm. It was faint at first, a soft scraping, like nails across glass. My stomach twisted as I realized it was coming from the living room window. I didn't want to look. I wanted to sit there forever, eyes shut, pretending none of this was happening. But instinct or stupidity made me rise. The knife felt too light in my hand, more useless than comforting. Keeping low, I crept toward the living room, the soft carpet muffling my steps. The sound was louder now, steady and deliberate, moving back and forth across the window pane. When I reached the corner, I pressed my back to the wall and waited. My breathing was loud in my ears, every exhale a betrayal of my position. Slowly, carefully, I leaned forward just enough to peek through the gap in the curtains. Something was standing on the lawn. The red moon cast enough light to see its outline, but my brain struggled to make sense of the shape. It was tall, its hunched body swaying unnaturally as it moved. Long, spindly arms ended in claws that glinted when they caught the light. Its head was turned toward the window, but I couldn't see its face. Not yet. The scraping stopped. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The creature's head tilted, its neck twisting too far to one side, then the other, as if it was listening for something. It took a step closer, then another. I stopped breathing. Finally, it leaned forward, pressing its face against the glass. My stomach flipped as I saw it up close. Its features were half human, half beast, grotesque in a way that felt unnatural. Patches of dark fur covered its elongated face, broken up by pale, raw skin that looked like it had been stretched too tightly over its skull. Yellow eyes glowed faintly, scanning the room with slow, deliberate movements. It opened its mouth, and I saw rows of jagged teeth glinting in the moonlight. Its breath fogged the glass as it exhaled, the sound low and guttural, more growl than sigh. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The thing let out a sudden snarl, its claws raking the glass hard enough to make the whole window shake. I flinched, the knife slipping from my grip and landing on the carpet with a soft thud. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. The creature's head snapped toward me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine through the gap in the curtains. I stumbled back, my heart racing as its snarling grew louder. It slammed its claws against the glass again, and this time, a long crack, spider-webbed across the pane. I grabbed the knife and bolted for the kitchen. The back door was my only chance. The growling followed me, echoing through the house. I glanced over my shoulder as I ran and saw the creature's shadow moving along the walls, distorted by the moonlight pouring through the windows. When I reached the kitchen, I fumbled with the lock on the back door, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn it. The moment it clicked open, I threw the door wide and sprinted into the backyard. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and biting against my skin. The moon hung high above, its crimson light illuminating every inch of the yard. I knew I couldn't stop moving. The fence was just ahead, a 6-foot wooden barrier that suddenly seemed impossibly tall. I ran for it, the grass slick beneath my feet, and scrambled to climb over. Behind me, the kitchen door slammed open. I didn't dare look back. I could hear the thing barreling after me, its claws tearing into the ground as it ran. I reached the top of the fence and threw myself over, landing hard on the other side. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to stand. The neighbor's yard was empty. Their house loomed ahead, dark and silent, but I didn't care. It was shelter. I limped toward their back door, hoping it was unlocked, praying I wasn't about to find it barred like my own had been. When I reached it, I grabbed the handle and twisted. It opened. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. The house smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet, like old fruit left to rot. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My ankle throbbed with every beat of my heart, but it didn't feel broken. The growling outside was gone. The only sound now was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house. For the first time in what felt like hours, I let myself relax. And then I heard it. A floorboard creaked above me. For a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the old house settling or the wind rattling the frame. That's what people say, isn't it? To explain away noises they don't want to think about. But deep down, I knew better. The floorboard creaked again, slow and deliberate, followed by another. Whatever was upstairs wasn't trying to be quiet. It was moving with purpose. My breathing hitched as I gripped the knife tighter, my fingers slippery with sweat. I pressed my ear against the door I'd just entered, listening for anything outside, any growls or scratching. Nothing. The creature outside was gone, but something was inside now. I took a cautious step forward, testing the weight on my injured ankle. Pain flared, sharp and white-hot, but I bit down the gasp threatening to escape. Noise was a death sentence. The kitchen was small, cluttered with dishes and rotting food that filled the air with a sickly sweet stench. Flies buzzed lazily around an overturned carton of milk on the counter. The refrigerator hummed softly, its faint light casting flickering shadows across the floor. I kept low, creeping toward the doorframe that led into the hall. The knife felt heavier than before, like my body was begging me to drop it and run. But where would I go? The house groaned above me again, louder this time. Don't go upstairs, I told myself. But my body kept moving, some horrible magnetism pulling me toward the source of the sound. I stepped into the hall, my feet brushing against a stained rug. The smell was stronger here, metallic and rancid, thick enough to choke on. My stomach churned as I spotted a dark smear trailing from the base of the stairs toward the living room. Blood. Don't follow it. But my eyes were drawn to the stairs. The crimson light from the moon poured in through a small window at the top, painting the narrow steps in shades of black and red. The air felt heavier here, pressing against my chest with every step I took closer. Then it stopped. The creaking, the groaning, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. I reached the base of the stairs, staring up into the shadows above. My heart pounded so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. And then the silence broke. A low growl rumbled from somewhere above me, deep and wet, like it was rising from the throat of something that wasn't fully human. I froze, the knife trembling in my grip. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get out of that house, to take my chances outside. But my legs wouldn't move. Something shifted in the shadows at the top of the stairs. It stepped forward into the light. The creature was massive, its hunched frame barely fitting within the narrow stairwell. Patches of coarse, matted fur clung to its pale skin, stretched tight over muscles that rippled with every movement. Its head twisted unnaturally, almost upside down, as it sniffed the air. It was holding something. At first, I thought it was a bundle of clothes, but then I saw the hand. A limp, bloodied hand dangling from its claws, fingers broken and twisted at impossible angles. The creature dropped the body with a sickening thud, and my stomach turned as I realized what, or who, it had been holding. It was one of the neighbors, their chests torn open, ribs glistening wet under the crimson moonlight. The creature tilted its head toward me, those glowing yellow eyes narrowing as its lips peeled back in a snarl. Blood dripped from its teeth, pooling on the wooden floor. It leaped. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. The knife flew from my hand as I hit the ground, my ankle exploding in pain. The creature landed halfway down the stairs, claws gouging deep into the wood as it crouched, readying itself to pounce. My hand scrambled for the knife, fingers brushing against the cool steel just as the creature lunged. I swung blindly. The blade connected, slicing through flesh. A spray of dark, warm blood splattered across my face as the creature howled in pain, the sound deafening in the narrow hall. It reared back, swiping wildly with its claws, and I rolled to the side, barely avoiding the blow. It came at me again, but this time I was ready. I plunged the knife upward, catching it under the jaw. The blade sank deep, and the creature's glowing eyes widened in shock. It thrashed, its claws raking against the walls as it tried to pull away, but I held on, driving the blade deeper. With a final guttural snarl, the creature collapsed, its massive body crashing to the floor in a heap. I didn't move. I couldn't. My chest heaved as I stared at the bloodied, motionless thing in front of me. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then I heard the howls. Not one, not two. Dozens. They were close now, filling the night with their mournful, predatory cries. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The knife was still clutched in my hand, its blade slick with blood. The door behind me shook as something slammed into it. Then the window shattered. Glass rained across the kitchen floor as the window shattered, shards glinting in the crimson glow of the moon. I spun around, knife in hand, as the first creature shoved its head through the opening. Its eyes glowed like embers, locking onto me with primal hunger. It wasn't alone. More shapes moved in the shadows outside, hulking figures pacing, their low growls blending into a menacing symphony. The one in the window clawed at the frame, splintering wood as it tried to force its massive body through. I ran. The hall stretched longer than it should have, every step dragging me toward the living room like I was running through wet cement. Behind me, the sound of tearing wood and snarling grew louder. Reaching the living room, I slammed the door behind me and shoved a heavy armchair against it. My ankle screamed in protest, the pain sharp and unrelenting, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I grabbed anything I could find, a lamp, a bookcase, and piled it against the door, each crash echoing like gunfire in the suffocating silence. The barricade wouldn't hold. The first thud against the door made the entire frame shudder, then another. The creatures weren't testing it anymore. They were trying to rip it apart. I backed away, knife shaking in my hand. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could buy me more time. The window, it was still intact, the curtains drawn tight. My mind raced. If I could get outside, make it to another house. The barricade exploded inward, shards of wood and fabric flying across the room. One of the creatures burst through, its claws slashing at the debris. It was bigger than the one I'd killed, its fur darker, its muscles more defined. Blood matted its jaws, and its glowing eyes burned with an intelligence that chilled me to the core. I bolted for the window, throwing the curtains open. The moonlight flooded in, painting the room in blood-red light. I unlatched the window, shoved it open, and hoisted myself onto the sill. My injured ankle gave out as I pushed off, and I fell hard onto the ground outside. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to stop. Behind me, the creature howled, a furious, guttural sound that echoed through the neighborhood. The others answered. The pack was coming. I crawled to my feet, limping across the backyard as fast as I could. The grass was slick with dew and blood. Was it mine? Someone else's? I didn't want to know. The neighbor's house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its door ajar. It was a gamble, but I didn't have a choice. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked the deadbolt, then slid to the floor. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't natural. I pressed my back against the door, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. Every sound outside seemed magnified. The rustling of leaves, the distant howls, the scraping of claws against concrete. Then a floorboard creaked upstairs. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, every nerve in my body on edge. Another creak followed, then another. Something was moving above me, slow and deliberate. I couldn't stay here. Pushing myself to my feet, I limped toward the kitchen, my eyes scanning every shadow for movement. The knife felt heavier in my hand, its bloodied blade glinting faintly in the moonlight, filtering through the windows. The stairs leading to the second floor loomed in the hallway. I stopped at the base, staring up into the darkness. A low growl rumbled from above. I backed away, moving toward the back door. My fingers brushed the lock, twisting it open as quietly as I could. The growl grew louder. I pulled the door open and slipped outside, shutting it behind me. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and biting, as I turned toward the alley that ran between the houses. I didn't get far. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision, and I froze. One of the creatures was standing at the edge of the alley, its head low, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Behind me, I heard the low growls of the others. I was surrounded. The alley stretched ahead of me like a dark tunnel, flanked by fences and shadows. My breath caught in my throat as the growls surrounded me, a chorus of primal hunger that reverberated through the narrow space. They were close, too close. The first creature stepped into the alley, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. Behind me, another growl rumbled, low and guttural. The pack had me pinned, and they knew it. I clenched the knife in my hand, its blade slick with blood that wasn't entirely dry. My injured ankle throbbed with every twitch of my muscles, but I forced myself to stay upright. Running wasn't an option anymore. The lead creature, larger than the others, its dark fur glistening under the red moonlight, lowered itself onto all fours, its claws scraping against the pavement. It let out a low snarl, lips peeling back to reveal jagged teeth. I braced myself, tightening my grip on the knife. It lunged. I dropped to the ground at the last second, rolling to the side as its claws raked the air where I'd been standing. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline drowned it out. The creature snarled in frustration, its claws skidding on the pavement as it turned to face me. I didn't give it the chance. Swinging the knife upward with every ounce of strength I had left, I drove it into the creature's throat. Blood sprayed across my face, hot and metallic, as the beast let out a choked howl. Its massive body collapsed onto me, its weight pinning me to the ground. I gasped for air, shoving the creature off with shaking arms. My entire body screamed in protest, but I forced myself to stand, gripping the bloodied knife like a lifeline. The rest of the pack wasn't waiting. Another one charged at me, its movements faster than anything I could have anticipated. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding its claws as it swiped at me. My back hit the fence, and I turned to run, limping down the alley as fast as my injured leg would allow. The pack followed. They weren't just chasing me, they were toying with me. Their growls echoed off the fences, coming from every direction, forcing me to second-guess every step. I reached the end of the alley and burst into the open yard of another house. The backyard was littered with debris, an overturned grill, children's toys scattered in the grass, a bicycle lying on its side. My eyes locked onto the shed at the far end of the yard. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. I limped toward it, every step feeling like a marathon. The pack was closing in, their growls growing louder with every passing second. When I reached the shed, I threw the door open and stumbled inside. The air was damp and musty, the space cluttered with tools and old paint cans. I slammed the door shut and slid the bolt into place, my hands trembling. The first impact came seconds later. The door shook violently as one of the creatures slammed into it, its claws raking against the wood. The walls creaked under the force, the thin boards barely holding together. I grabbed a hammer from the workbench, clutching it in my free hand as the knife stayed in the other. The creatures outside snarled and growled, their heavy footsteps circling the shed. One of them let out a long, piercing howl. Then, silence. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The silence dragged on, oppressive and suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps, every nerve in my body screaming that this wasn't over. The roof caved in. Splinters and debris rained down as one of the creatures crashed through the ceiling, its claws tearing at the wooden beams. I threw myself to the ground, narrowly avoiding the debris as the beast landed in front of me. Its massive frame filled the tiny space, its glowing eyes fixed on me with predatory intent. It lunged. I swung the hammer, connecting with its jaw. The impact sent it reeling back, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It snarled, its claws swiping at me, catching my arm and leaving a deep, burning gash. I screamed, the pain blinding, but I didn't stop. I drove the knife upward, catching it under the ribs. The creature howled, its massive body convulsing as it collapsed onto the floor. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. Climbing through the hole in the roof, I pulled myself onto the shed's top, every movement agony. From this vantage point, I saw the pack circling below, their glowing eyes cutting through the shadows. The largest one, the alpha, stood in the middle of the yard, its head tilted back as it let out a deafening howl. The sound carried across the neighborhood, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. Then the howls answered. Not just from the pack below me, but from all around. Distant echoes carried on the wind, each one a promise of more horrors to come. The howls echoed into the night, a chorus of dread that seemed to rattle the very air. From my vantage point on the shed roof, I could see them closing in, hulking figures moving through the crimson-stained shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The alpha stood motionless in the yard below, its massive frame taut with predatory focus, its head turned slowly, its burning gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, the world fell silent, save for the hammering of my heart. Then it moved. Its claws dug into the ground as it crouched, preparing to leap. I scrambled backward, nearly losing my footing on the unstable roof, my injured leg screaming in protest. The knife in my hand felt useless against something like that, something that shouldn't even exist. The alpha lunged. The impact shattered the roof beneath me, and I fell hard, crashing back into the shed. Pain flared through my body as I landed amidst broken tools and splintered wood. The alpha dropped down after me, its massive frame blocking the only exit. Its growl was low and guttural, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It didn't attack immediately. It didn't need to. The thing was toying with me, savoring the fear radiating off me like heat. I forced myself to my feet, the knife trembling in my blood-slick hand. My eyes darted around the ruined shed, searching for anything that could give me an edge. The alpha lunged, claws raking through the air. I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. The momentum carried the creature into the wall, splintering it, but it recovered instantly, its glowing eyes narrowing in fury. This time it didn't hesitate. It came at me with terrifying speed, and I swung wildly, the knife connecting with its shoulder. The blade sliced through flesh, but the creature didn't even flinch. Its claws caught me across the chest, ripping through fabric and skin. I screamed, stumbling back as blood poured from the wound. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought that was it, that I was done. But then my hand brushed against something on the floor. A gas canister. My fingers closed around it, my mind racing as the alpha advanced, its claws clicking against the concrete. I gripped the canister with both hands, swinging it upward as the creature lunged. The impact knocked it back, momentarily dazed. I didn't wait. I yanked the cap off the gas canister, the fumes hitting my nose like a slap. The alpha shook its massive head, snarling as it recovered, but I was already moving. Grabbing a shattered piece of wood from the floor, I wrapped a rag around the end and dipped it into the gas. My movements were frantic, my hands slick with blood and sweat. The creature lunged again, its claws catching my leg and dragging me to the ground. Pain erupted through my body, but I didn't let go of the makeshift torch. I reached into my pocket, my fingers fumbling for the lighter I'd stuffed there earlier. The alpha loomed over me, its jaws opening wide, saliva dripping onto my face. The lighter sparked. The flame caught the rag instantly, the fire roaring to life. I swung the torch upward, jamming it into the creature's face. It howled, a deafening sound that shook the walls. The flame spread quickly, catching on its fur, its eyes wild with pain and fury. I didn't stop. I grabbed the gas canister, hurling it at the creature's burning body. The explosion wasn't as loud as I expected, but it was enough. The flames engulfed the shed, the heat searing my skin as I stumbled toward the door. The alpha thrashed wildly, its howls echoing into the night as the fire consumed it. I collapsed just outside the shed, the cool night air hitting my face like a blessing. But I wasn't safe yet. The rest of the pack stood in the yard, their glowing eyes fixed on me. For a moment, none of us moved. The flames crackled behind me, the smell of burning fur thick in the air. Then they turned and fled. One by one, the creatures disappeared into the shadows, their howls fading into the distance. The alpha's death had broken them. I stayed on the ground, too weak to move, staring up at the blood-red moon as dawn began to creep into the sky. The crimson light faded, replaced by the pale hues of morning. The neighborhood was silent now, the streets littered with debris, blood, and the bodies of the unlucky. I forced myself to my feet, every step agony, and began to limp toward the remains of my house. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if the nightmare was over or if it was only the beginning. All I knew was that I'd survived. For now. The sun rose higher, casting a golden light over the ruined neighborhood. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at my reflection in the shattered remains of the mirror. Blood smeared my face, dried and cracked. But it wasn't the cuts or bruises that caught my attention. It was my eyes. Just for a moment, they flickered, yellow, glowing faintly, like embers waiting to catch.